Today is Sunday, August 6th, 2017, and this is episode 198 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me tonight, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Welcome back to the United States of America, Mr. Bell.
It is good to be back.
I personally lost a bet that they were going to allow you back in, but hey, I'm glad you're here.
I think I snuck in.
And how was your wonderful world travels?
It was good. Ireland was very nice. Hungary was nice. The flights were not very nice. Mm-hmm. I need to be able to detach my legs. That's what I've learned. If I could detach my legs, it'd be much more enjoyable.
Well, that is possible. It's painful.
Yeah, I suppose.
It would certainly be an elective medical procedure.
Yep. Anyhow, it was a good trip. Good to be back. Met some really great people while I was over there, and here I am, jet lag free finally.
Yeah, it takes some time. I know. I did a couple of Israel trips in previous roles, and it can kick your butt.
Oh yeah. So just a reminder that the thoughts and opinions we express on the show are ours and do not represent those of our employers. And a couple of announcements. B-Sides Chattanooga has their CFP open until September 1st. That conference happens on March 28th, 2018, and you can find more information at bsidecha.com. Coming up in September is DerbyCon. We'll be there, and then at the end of October is the O'Reilly Security Conference in New York, and we'll both be there. And I think we have a discount code, if I'm not mistaken.
We do. Do you remember it?
I don't.
I'll look it up real quick.
Anyhow, I think it's I'm not even going to try to guess. We'll come back to it. And then in the next March, we will be in Bogota, Colombia at the Tactical Edge. Yeah, I knew it had something to do with a knife. Yeah.
By the way, the code for getting 20% off gold, silver, and bronze passes to the O'Reilly Security Conference is Security20.
There you go.
There you go.
Good deal. And then also just a shout out at the start. Thank you to all of our Patreon donors. Definitely appreciate you.
Absolutely. You guys are awesome. It still amazes and humbles me that you guys give your hard-earned money to us. Thank you.
Absolutely. So before we get into our actual stories, there something happened this past week which is kind of out of the ordinary for what we would normally talk about, but since it's all the rage, we thought we would talk about it a little bit.
You're talking about Dances with the Stars, aren't you?
Yes. Mm-hmm. What did you think? No, of course not. I'm talking about the very controversial arrest of Malware Tech Blog, or otherwise known as Marcus Hutchins,
who is well known for stopping the WannaCry outbreak by registering the kill domain. Correct,
and then subsequently was very controversial doxed by some journalists.
Mm-hmm. So young guy, what? He's like 24, I think.
22, I think.
22.
He's younger than that. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yes, he was leaving Las Vegas on his way home, which I believe is in the UK, and while he was waiting for his flight about to board, apparently the FBI came and arrested him.
And the Twitter sphere exploded.
Oh yeah. Well, and honestly, for some time, when these kinds of things happen, the person just disappears. They go off the radar, right. And so that leads to, wanton speculation. And eventually it was indeed confirmed that he had been arrested, and that of course set off a firestorm of further controversy, which didn't really kind of stabilize until the indictment was made public. And it was made public, and he was charged with selling the Kronos banking malware back a couple years ago. I think it was for all of like $7,000, and he wasn't even the main actor, as I recall.
Yeah, he a conspirator to update and sell.
Right.
Yeah, it was interesting. I certainly don't have a strong opinion on guilt or innocence at this point. I think that that's entirely what, hopefully, the justice system will determine. It is. I would say I saw a lot of incredibly rushed jumps to judgment and opinion on Twitter of both sides, which I don't think is very helpful. I think until we know the facts of a situation, it's very difficult to react appropriately, and a whole lot of people were reacting very strongly before they really knew what was going on. Now, again, I have no idea of the validity of these charges. I don't know the case, but I certainly understand that the urge to rush to defend somebody in the security industry and somebody, one of our guys, as many people say. But I just, first reports are always so sketchy in any sort of situation like this. And I really hope people learn to at least take a breath and try to get more information before some of the very reckless declarations I saw on Twitter.
Yeah, and kind of in both directions. I mean, there's been some pretty nasty accusations thrown at him, which I think is really not very fair to be doing when someone's in his situation. There was a really terribly tacky story posted about how he was spending all this money, and I think this was trying to equate because at approximately the same time, maybe like a day before, the big news was the WannaCry Bitcoin wallet was emptied of like $140,000, right? And then the insinuation of this particular journalist was, hey, Marcus is running around Las Vegas, renting Lamborghinis and staying at a $1,500 a night hotel. But someone pointed out that he wasn't paying for any of that. Like those were other.
Yeah, and it's Las Vegas, guys.
Right.
Well, and somebody, I think it was Gizmodo, who absolutely, I think, was incredibly inappropriate, posted things like, well, he was shooting very scary machine guns.
Yeah, well, the DA went, or the prosecutor brought that up too.
Yeah, and the judge wisely shot that down as irrelevant.
That was a good pun, by the way.
You're welcome. Thanks. This is the kind of stuff that just drives me crazy when I read this. And again, I don't have a dog in this hunt, one way or the other. I don't know. I don't know if he's guilty. I don't know if he's innocent. I don't have a wish around it either. I don't want him to be guilty. I don't know. It's an interesting story. It's part of our, it certainly wouldn't be the first time we've seen this happen. It's not outside the realms of previous experience that sometimes you see young, talented kids messing around with malware, and then they try to go clean and start working on the white hat side. It's seen it since day one in this industry. But again, I'm not saying that's what happened. We don't know what happened.
Right.
We just have an indictment. And
yep,
from what I've read, it's kind of flimsy, but it's early in the process, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, we really don't know what the evidence is. We know that the prosecution alleges that he confessed, and by the way, apparently he was held for about 48 hours without legal representation, and allegedly during which he confessed to doing it. Now, what's interesting is, there's obviously been a lot of discussion and research and whatnot about the things he's said on Twitter and posted on his blog in the past. And someone pointed out that he did in fact write some code that apparently was incorporated into the malware that is named in the indictment. But then he also publicly on Twitter said he basically said he was outraged that they had included his code in the malware. So
to be fair, lots of times people reuse code, and sometimes for malicious purposes.
Absolutely.
We know a number of security researchers who've written anything from scanning tools to proof of concept code to whatever that could easily be twisted into malware.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, NotPetya had Mimikatz embedded in it and NPSexec. So
there you go. Again, not trying to make a case one way or the other, just that this could turn out to be a whole bunch of mistakes, or there could be something here. We don't know.
Yeah, I think that one of the reasons this has got so much traction in the security field is it may set a precedent, and a potentially really troubling precedent if if the thing that he is guilty of is writing, let's say, that that hooking code that was then reused in the malware. If that's what he's going to be convicted on, rather than actually creating malware for for the purpose of committing crimes and then selling it on to someone else, which would clearly in most people's eyes be illegal. The concern is that there's a lot of security researchers who in the execution of their their learning and whatnot, developing tools for penetration testing and whatnot, would create things like Mimikatz and many other tools that could and have been used in attacks. And so now the concern, I think, is that does this set a precedent that the people who write those things are now fair game for prosecution, and that it does in fact happen, that is a really big problem for the industry. So I think that's one of the reasons there's a lot of other than the personal aspect, I think that's the other reason there's a lot of focus on this.
Yeah, and I can certainly understand that concern. I think it's too early to jump to that conclusion. Certainly we want to guard against that. We'll see. I saw a whole bunch of people on Twitter basically swearing off any work with government agencies, and just going off on a situation we don't know the full facts on. Now, it may come to that. It may warrant that. I'm certainly not one who trusts or believes in a lot of what the government does. I'm very skeptical. But sometimes a rose is just a rose, and maybe we need to wait and see what happens. I do think that he is entitled to a very vigorous and valid defense, and I know that a defense fund's been set up, and I see it completely warranted to contribute to that defense fund. But we've got to, unless we completely don't believe in the process any longer, we've got to let that play out a little bit before we decide if this is going to change our working relationship with law enforcement.
Yep, certainly agree. So anyway, we'll continue to monitor that, and if there's anything more to discuss about it, we'll do that in the future. The good news is, I guess it's good news for him, is that he apparently gets out on bail tomorrow. So that's good.
You got to think it's a pretty scary situation.
Well, yeah. It absolutely. You're in a foreign country. You're 22 years old, and you've been arrested while in the airport for something you did when you were 17 or 18. Right? That's pretty scary. So
yeah. So to be determined. These things take a long, long time to play out. We'll see what happens.
Yep. Absolutely. So let's get into some stories. And the first story today comes from Dark Reading, and the title is WannaCry Inspires Worm-like Module and TrickBot. And the thing that I wanted to talk about with this is, there's nothing particularly interesting about TrickBot other than the fact that I think we're seeing a malicious uptake in the worm spreading tactic, and that was kind of my concern that WannaCry and NotPetya kind of opened the eyes of I think many garden variety criminals, and I
Or perhaps reopen them.
or reopen them, sure. But I think there was I think we went a generation without any real significant worm activity.
Yeah, that's true. It has been a while. And you did predict very strongly that this will probably lead to more of these types of attacks. Of course, success begets success.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the concern I have is there's you don't need any particular vulnerabilities for this to work, right? The kinds of things, or the kinds of weaknesses, I guess as I'll call them, are endemic in many organizations. And I know I pick on Active Directory a lot, and I know that a lot of times it's not fair, but honestly, I think companies are going to have to very quickly get their house in order with Active Directory permissions, or this is going to be a really big problem for them.
Agreed, but that is such a difficult task, and it's so siloed. So rarely have I seen an organization where the InfoSec guys are actually that deeply involved with how AD is run at that level.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I don't disagree, but it's kind of a pay me now and pay me later thing. Like you can, an organization can rip the Band-Aid off and start to do it now, or they can wait till they are toast and they have to completely rebuild Active Directory, and then they can do it right.
So what sorts of things are you thinking? To me, good privileged account management, cred vaulting, not having the same easily captured and replayed AD credentials. What other sort of stuff are you thinking about in terms of hardening AD against these sorts of things?
Well, there's a whole host of things. Like you need to be running Credential Guard if you're running Windows 10 and Windows 2000 Server 2016. If you're not, you need to disable the wdigest password caching in memory. You need to make sure you have different local admin passwords on all systems. Domain admins should not be allowed to log into domain controllers or things like Exchange servers. Local administrators should not be allowed to log in to a system over the network. And on and on. I mean, there's a whole host of,
Sure.
of best practices, and unfortunately, I think for convenience sake, a lot of organizations have kind of either are not aware of these things, these best practices, and really important security requirements because they haven't been bit by them.
Sure. I mean, it goes all the way back to what version of SMB and NTLM authentication you're running in your environment.
Right, absolutely.
And all those sorts of GPO type settings. There's a ton of things that we can do to harden against capturing hashes and replaying them. But especially, I think, for older organizations that have been running AD for a long time, they probably have never updated those settings as they progressed through the various versions and layers and upgraded over the years for their Windows servers and desktops, and they're probably still running old versions of this stuff. And if it doesn't broke, don't touch it, kind of thing. Yeah,
that's right. And I think a lot of certainly what I've seen is a lot of organizations did start long ago in a universe far, far away, and their Active Directory environment has just kind of evolved organically over time, and kind of like Windows itself, right? The old vestiges of things never get turned off because, my goodness, it might break something. So we'll just we'll upgrade and we'll leave everything else in place. So
knowing the dependencies in a complex environment may be very difficult.
Absolutely. And I'm not saying this is easy. And
no,
I don't mean to imply that.
It's probably a year-long project.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it may be difficult to sell the organization on that project, but I think it's very important. I think it's absolutely almost table stakes going forward.
Yeah, I guess I'm here saying, watch your back, because this is we have a new threat to worry about that we really hadn't had to worry about in the past, and there's some really well worn paths on how these things can be used by the bad guys. So there you have it. Anyway, TrickBot is, it's I would call kind of garden variety malware, banking malware. It's historically not been commonly targeted in Western countries, but apparently that's changed as of last month. They're starting to target, the U.S. and the U.K. and a couple of other more developed countries. So, by the way, this particular variant of TrickBot, it had some code that looks like it's got the kind of nascent start of a SMB worm type spreading, but it doesn't actually. Apparently, it's not a complete setup. So the thinking of these researchers is this is kind of like a trial run to go and figure out, what's the next step. What do they need to do to make this work? So anyway, I just, as I've said before, I think we're going to see a whole lot more of this. So, put your helmet on, get your house in order.
And if we're up to Jerry, just turn off AD, because
no,
you're an AD hater.
I maybe so. Maybe I am. Maybe I am.
We'll come up with the term for it.
It's not that I hate AD. It's that I hate the way people use AD. How about that? So anyway, moving on to our next story, which comes from Security Week, and the title is 1 million exposed to adware via hijack Chrome extension.
This is an interesting one, and there's a kind of a companion story that I want to mention after we talk through this one too.
Sure. So a couple days ago, a developer for a Chrome plugin basically was phished, right? He got an email that purported to come from the Chrome store, the Chrome plugin store, saying that there was something wrong, and so he logged in to take a look and didn't really realize at the time that he had been phished until a couple of days later when he started getting complaints that his plugin was bombarding users with ads. And so apparently this particular plugin is approximately a million users. So that's a pretty big deal. And apparently what happened was bad guys phished him, got his credentials, uploaded a malicious adware laden version of the plugin, which then started getting auto updated on Chrome installs worldwide. And as that happened, people started getting the ads. And at least at the time the story was written, it sounds like they're not entirely sure what else that malicious version of the plugin may have done. So they're recommending users change their passwords and any API keys to things like Cloudflare and some other things. But I thought this was really interesting, kind of in the wake of the NotPetya thing, because now we're starting to see, kind of like we're predisposed to look for patterns here, right? And one of the patterns I'm seeing emerging here is malicious updates to pervasively installed software is a really attractive attack point.
Yeah, we're abusing the pre-established trust channel.
Right.
Especially because we've trained people now to trust those updates and to always install updates and accept updates when they're offered. And
right, and we beat. I mean, in fact, we beat people about that. Right? I mean, we beat them up and say you're going to get in trouble if you don't install it or whatnot. So I mean, in some respects, that has kind of worked against us. I mean, obviously, it's still the right advice. But I think we have this new problem that this as a attack vector is, I think, gaining some attention.
It is. I would argue that in some ways this is kind of like shark attack stories, that they're incredibly rare, but they get a lot of coverage. And then you have to figure out what is the likelihood of this truly being a risk factor against the more common things that are not reported.
Well, I mean, sure,
And
but
I'm sure there's a technical term for it. I just don't know it offhand.
the shark attack syndrome is fine. But I guess another way to look at it is that at some point, is it really a shark attack thing that happens infrequently all the time, and now it's just being reported, or is this really something new? And
That is the question.
right,
And another story that I was reading about this is some defunct plugins that have a lot of users out there are being purchased and then basically co-opted into being malware delivery channels.
right,
So, you've got a plugin that you developed. You've got 500,000 users out there. You're not really developing it or maintaining it anymore. Somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I'll give you $50,000 for that. Sure, here you go. And now they basically buy access to your users and then can push out whatever they want.
yeah. And then we it wasn't exactly the same, but we kind of saw that with AdBlock Plus, right?
Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
they were an ad blocking plugin, and suddenly they were a way for companies to get their ads to your computer.
Well, see, it's that step 3 before profit that they're starting to figure out.
Obviously. But point is that now anytime you have a that kind of broad real estate, there's there's a potential, and the abandoned plugins is a great example.
And then I wonder if, this hit Chrome, which is fairly well regarded for security. I wonder if there is some sort of reaction that will eventually come from the browser manufacturers to vet this further. I don't know. This becomes a real issue. They may take a step into that. But this is a tough one. This is a really tough one to figure out. And there's no perfect solution for Google to scan plugins to make sure they're not malicious. It's that's like having a perfect AV solution. It just doesn't work that way.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Especially given the broad functionality that those plugins give. I mean, they have everything from proxy plugins to filter ad filtering to password managers. So I mean it would be really difficult to profile what is malicious type activity, because you're going to see basically everything is legitimate in some plugin or other.
It's true. Yeah.
So anyway, another thing to keep an eye on. I do think, by the way, that I was thinking about this on the plane ride back. We historically have thought about certain kinds of vendors as being the ones that are really risky to us, and so maybe we add an extra question or two to their kabuki dance spreadsheet that we send them,
which they are committed upon the honor of their house and family to answer honestly.
Exactly, and so but anyway, there are certain of our vendors that we intuitively know are more risky, and I would almost guarantee, maybe not guarantee, but I almost guarantee that most organizations would never think about software as software vendors as one of those vendors to be concerned about. They're kind of thinking about the vendors who have like a VPN access to their network or something like that. They're not thinking about Microsoft or Oracle or Intellect Services.
Right. But the bad guys are going to keep probing for any and all weaknesses.
Yeah.
It's almost like the million monkeys on a million keyboards.
Sure.
And they're really looking at this almost as a psychological attack now of what can we leverage, what trust can we abuse to get done what we need to get done.
Right.
And that means it's going to constantly change, which is a challenge when I see these really large, complex, mature organizations that have really mature, robust, all-encompassing audit policies and management of InfoSec risk, and they're spending so many cycles auditing against defenses for the previous risk issues.
Right.
And they've spent so much time and effort that they're not meeting these previous issues, that they're not necessarily nimble enough to deal with new issues because they're using all their staff time up answering audits and providing evidence and producing reports and not really being ready to adapt to a new threat.
Fighting yesterday's battles.
Yeah, I was trying to avoid that term, but yeah.
Yep. Yep.
I mean, it is the most appropriate term. You're fighting the last cyber war. And I don't know a better way to do it, but I definitely see that as a weakness right now with these large, mature, quote-unquote, mature security organizations.
Yeah, and I've been wondering, what's the end game? Because, like you said, this is a psychological war, and really the only winning strategy is not to play, and so.
Well, there is no end game. It's continuous.
Yeah, but I guess the point is that we are either resigned to that there's always going to be the next attack vector that we have to go and scramble to defend against, or we're just, we kind of, I don't know, we kind of live in constant fear, and I think we.
Well, let's take it back to the physical world for a minute. It's kind of, if we equate it back to normal physical crime, it never really goes away. You can do things to help reduce it. You can do things that backfire in reducing it or increase it or allow an environment for it to decrease. It's more a matter of how do you set up an environment in your organization that can survive most criminal acts. Most companies aren't going to go out of business if somebody breaks in the door and steals some stuff, because they have adapted their risk model, their insurance model, their whatever it may be, to deal with that eventuality. They don't want to happen, but it may happen. So in my mind, it's more about resilience of your organization and expecting something bad to happen. Not in fear, but, hey, this is the real world that we live in.
Yeah, I guess I probably did a bad job of saying what I was thinking there. So
I'll blame the jet lag.
so as time goes on, and the snowball is rolling down the hill, and it's collecting new attack strategies, and your point about we're auditing last year's or yesterday's. Auditing the controls that prevented yesterday's threats, that none of those old threats go away. We're only adding new ones, and so it seems like we're creating this just monumental amount of overhead in terms of security controls and audits and whatnot. That is, it's going to, in my mind at least, really water down the whole value proposition that IT brought in the first place, because and I don't think we're there yet, right? But it's not hard to see that if you have to start, for instance, being really suspect of all of your software providers, and exercising some kind of due diligence on all of them, and then what after that. And everything else that you've been doing, you still have to keep doing, and now you got to go and do this big new thing, and then tomorrow there's going to be something else.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I think at the end of the day, business is still going to do business, and business doesn't really want to do security. Business doesn't really want to do legal. Business doesn't really want to do finance. These are things they have to do.
Sure.
To do what they want to do. So I think that in many ways, we're kind of like firefighters. We're going to go to where the fire's burning and try to address that.
Yeah. Well, clearly. Yeah.
And hopefully for the older, more well understood attacks, we have built in more consistent defenses. The ecosystem has adapted. You know, you've gotten the briefings from Microsoft on how to harden your AD environment against, pass the hash. Now, did you do it? Well, that's a different question.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of thing. You've got better tools out there to adapt to more sophisticated phishing attacks. It's an arms race. The question is, where and how do you spend your time? And I think that is the tough part of a CISO's job, is figuring that out. And especially when that is dictated to you by an external auditor or third party, that gets really complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, moving on to our last story for today. This one comes from Dark Reading, and the title is, Can Your Risk Assessment Stand Up Under Scrutiny? And I thought this was a great story because it captures very well, I think, what is one of the fundamental problems in security today. And I'll sum it up in one sentence in this article, which I think explains the challenge of IT security front to back. Quote, if an organization omits or misjudges a critical risk, then the decisions that flow from that finding will be incorrect. End quote.
Yeah, this was a really interesting article. I had a lot of different thoughts on this article as I was reading it, and then I got to give credit to the author. He addressed most of those thoughts as he went through the article. I personally thought you were going to say the number one problem for IT security was mansplaining, but I can see the point you're going with here.
Well, you caught me off guard with that one. Yep. So, anyhow, I
bet the listeners can tell we're tired today.
Yeah, it's been a long month.
Yeah. We'll get back to our normal peppy self soon. Don't worry.
It's been a long month for me. Anyway, the author here does a nice job of kind of highlighting some of the problems. He points out that historically, doing a risk assessment has been kind of the important thing, right? There's been no expectation of quality. And he points out that there was an FTC action against a company called Abbott Labs, and they kind of spanked Abbott. The FTC kind of spanked Abbott Labs because they did a risk assessment, but I would summarize it as saying they did a pretty shoddy job at a risk assessment. They didn't consider all of the risks that they actually referred to in other venues, right? I mean, they like a particular hard-coded password, they considered basically a feature in one area and then didn't talk about it as a risk in a different area. So,
but that brings up a really interesting point to me, which is risk analysis can be very subjective. And in this case, yes, we're using a very obvious example that I think most people could agree to. But let's just say for the sake of discussion that FTC's view of what is a significant risk may be very different than Abbott Labs' view on that. And anytime you take an external third party and you have them judge your risk, there's often a rational, reasonable dispute of a difference of opinion, as an organization may see risks that they view as acceptable, that some random third party may have a different view of what's acceptable and what isn't based on their bias and their experience and their hot buttons and what they've seen burn other companies or their focus. It's not really a black and white thing right now. And so that leads to, how do we make this more objective? Mm-hmm. And make it, and should we? Right? There's a part of this that businesses taking risks allows them to make money. You cannot reduce risk to zero. And one of the things that determines a winner and loser in a destructive capitalist environment is the folks who, in part, make those correct decisions versus those who don't.
I agree, but I take exception to one thing,
Okay.
and I think that is there's a difference between accepting a risk in the pursuit of business and profit, and knowingly taking that risk, and between that and being ignorant,
Agreed.
either willfully or or negligently, right?
It's like you read my notes because I actually have
Okay.
that. I was actually going to say this as we got further into the story is that I've worked with organizations that have wonderful risk analysis teams. And they look at things and they find risk and they write it up, and that risk goes to management, and then nothing happens. There's no definitive documentation as to why that risk is accepted.
Mm-hmm.
There's no thought process around it, and that's talked about in the story here is how do you quantify how and why you accept a risk? And so I think you hit that on the head, which is how often is management not understanding the risks they're accepting, that they are ignorant to it until it comes and bites them in the ass.
Exactly.
And then the question is, are the risks involved with IT security so archaic and weird and difficult for non-IT security folks to grasp that we feel they should intrinsically understand the risk we're saying, and management doesn't get it because that's not their specialty, and this is a highly specialized environment. And then it comes back to, is management saying, well, the CISO should have handled this, et cetera, et cetera. I do think there's something broken there. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, this comes down to communication in large measure, right? And because you're absolutely right. The CISO, or I'm sorry, the CEO or the CFO isn't going to be a technical expert. They're not going to be the one to make a judgment call on, are we going to use the same local admin password on all of our systems? Like that. That's not the level they operate at. They need to
Right.
know, a more tangible way to think about it in terms of value at risk, I guess, is to use a term. And that kind of comes back to us. And I think one of the issues I see with risk assessments is well, I guess a couple things. One is a lot of times they're gone into with the end in mind. And the risk assessment is a formal process to document what somebody's already concluded. And so that's a problem. And then the other is,
Sure.
we see this, and I've talked about this at length, is a lack of imagination on the part of IT people to really understand the ways that things can go wrong.
Is it, I agree with you, but is it truly imagination or is it mindset? I think we IT security folks have trained ourselves to think failure conditions. And I think a lot of IT folks train themselves to think, integration and success conditions.
Sure. Yep.
And perhaps it's a mindset issue.
Well, I mean, there's no doubt about that.
And sorry, continue your point. I didn't want to completely interrupt you though.
No, and then I think the last part is communication, right? Being able to turn that into something tangible for a business manager to be able to accept or mitigate. Because again, I think one of the fundamental problems is they talk about here in the article is, well, actually you brought it up. I take that back. Companies have to deal with risk to make money. But the fundamental problem I see time and again is that management isn't aware of the risks that they're accepting, and I think that in many ways this is a failure of IT security to comprehend that and communicate that risk. Now, what that means and how to do it right, I don't have the right answer. If I did, I probably be sleeping better at night. But
Yeah, it's a tough problem because let's play that up. We'll keep picking on AD for a minute. How do we, as senior security people, go to a CEO and say, we really need to harden our ID? CEO goes, okay, what happens if we don't? Well, we might get hacked. Okay, what does that mean? Well, we might lose money. How much money? I need you to put this in some sort of terms that I can quantify. I'm curious. I want to hear what you have to say, but you've got to tell me in terms that I can balance against everything else I have going on.
yes,
Because we cannot address all risk at once either. They have to be prioritized.
right.
And it's interesting because one of the things this article said, and I'll come back and quote this part because I think it's good, but it also has an issue I take exception to. Quote, a risk assessment must also be read and used to manage the risk it identifies. A thick, beautifully detailed risk report that sits on the shelf is not only useless, it's a clear indicator of negligence. Okay, I agree to a certain extent. Quoting again, imagine a regulator asking you, quote, you knew about the risk, why didn't you do anything about it, end quote. Acting on a risk assessment also means verifying the risk was reduced by active risk management processes. Okay. Sounds great in a vacuum. What happens when I've got 50 critical risks in my organization? Which, by the way, is very real and very often the case.
Oh, absolutely. Right.
So we have to pick and choose which ones we can go after once. We can't fix them all at once. We can't incur that kind of cost or disruption. So we have to roll the dice on which ones are going to bite us and which ones aren't.
Yeah, but I think maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I think what the act of prioritization is part of that, right? So if you end up with let's say 100 really critical risks that you have to deal with, and you can deal with 3. You're going to go through some process to figure out which are the 3 you're going to deal with.
Right.
And it's not that you're ignoring the other ones, it's that you've consciously prioritized that. And I don't think that's what he's saying. I think
agreed.
I think what he's saying is that, they go through this process and then, it goes into a binder and goes on the shelf and nobody thinks about it again.
Yeah, because the bad guys look at your risk register before they attack you.
Of course, they always do. Yes.
And they can't attack you with something if it's on your risk register. No, I'm perhaps extrapolating a little past his point, which is that any one risk in a vacuum can be easily dissected and in hindsight say, well, you're an idiot for not fixing it. And what I'm trying to say is that it's rarely a discrete risk in a vacuum.
Absolutely. But I think, if you're in that adversarial relationship or adversarial condition with a regulator, and something has bitten you on the butt and it was, number 4 on your list of 100 and you were only doing the top 3, you have hopefully some kind of documented plan that says, we did this risk assessment, it found 100 things, we rank ordered them, we drew a line, we're dealing with the top 3 at some point, and we'll go back and do the, that's a different discussion and I'll tell you,
Agreed.
I mean, I've been here, right, with government regulators, and it's a different discussion. If you can say that, certainly they could say, well, we disagree, but that's a whole different discussion because now they're just disagreeing with maybe your assessment of the risk. They're not saying that you're completely out of control, and so I think that's a different. You're on a different.
It is.
Level
it
there.
is. I agreed. I think the other thing I would say though is that anybody worth their salt can find risk.
Yes.
So do we also have a bit of a boy who cried wolf situation there? And maybe that's a whole different conversation. I guess what I'm saying is that this concept is still so squishy, it's really hard to wrap definitive guidance around. And when you start introducing a lot of third parties who are judging it, it's going to get even squishier.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with you there. So anyway, Anything else?
Yeah, the other thing is DEF CON Black Hat just happened.
Yeah.
We don't have any official.
I missed it again for another year.
That's true. One of these years will go. Anything come out of it that you thought was worthy of talking about? I didn't see a ton.
Voting machines were hacked within 90 minutes.
Yeah.
Not a terrible surprise there. Somebody figured out how to hack many types of home routers provided by ISPs. Nothing, incredibly novel there. I heard that Alex Stamos's keynote at DEF CON was apparently pretty good.
Yes, I've been wanting to watch it. I have not had a chance. Apparently, some of the highlights were we need to have more empathy for our users, which in general I agree with. I think we get arrogant about our stupid users and such. And again, psychological war, guys.
Yep. And that's about it. I have a lot of people that I'm Twitter friends with who were there or gave presentations. So I think all the feedback I got was pretty good. There's apparently always the unfortunate aspects of any mass gathering of people like that, but didn't seem like it was too out of control.
In terms of people being idiots.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but it's going to happen. Not that it makes it right. It's
human nature, unfortunately. Anyway, that I think that was all I had heard. I think the B-Sides talks are online, and I have not had any chance to go and look at those yet. I did watch one talk from the Proving Grounds. It was on the Russian propaganda. It was really interesting. I'll see if I can find the link and post it. It was basically talking about the lady who gave the talk was talking about her time in Russia was during the takeover of Crimea, and she talks about the propaganda campaign that they ran and the perspective, because she had intentionally she's from the U.S., but she had intentionally shut herself out of any Western media while she was there to kind of like do the whole Russian language immersion thing. And so she talks about the kind of the impact of the propaganda machine. So really interesting.
Nice. Yeah, I would be interested in that.
Anyhow, I think that's it for today. Anything else from you?
No, just thanks as always to our loyal listeners and donors and friends, and con season's coming up, so hopefully we'll get to see some of you guys in person soon. I'm still constantly amazed at the love and support the show gets, so thank you.
Absolutely. Talk to you again next week. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a good week.
See ya.